In April 2026, a jaw-dropping megaproject proposal took the world by surprise. It came from the Emirati architecture firm Znera Space. Their seemingly impossible idea, so much so in fact that many in the press and online mistook it at first for a joke, is to build a waterway from the Persian Gulf through the United Arab Emirates and all the way to the Gulf of Oman, on the other side of the Musandam Peninsula. The project would cost an astronomical sum, and it would be so technically difficult that more than a few analysts have dismissed it as all but impossible. However, there is a reason for the timing of this unexpected proposal, and a reason why the UAE might just want to bet big on building the unbuildable right now. Look where it is, the Strait of Hormuz, a critical global maritime chokepoint responsible for 1/5 of the world's oil consumption, has been effectively closed since February 28th due to the war between Iran and the US/Israel. There is still currently no clear end to this closure in sight, and even after a political reopening, a return to normal, safe shipping could still take an additional 6 months. The Associated Press recently called the Strait of Hormuz the world's most important 21 miles. If the UAE were to build this new waterway, it would completely upend that notion. But how hard would that actually be to achieve? How likely is it to actually get built? And what wider effects would such a dramatic revolution in Middle East trade corridor dominance have on the world as we know it? Join us in this episode of Looking For as we explore Znera Space's radical proposal from back to front and try to make sense of this project they call the Union Strait. When, in late April 2026, Znera Space announced its unexpected proposal for the Union Strait, most people, even those privy to current trends in the architecture world, had never heard of such a thing. But the surprising truth is, Znera is far from the first to dream of such a waterway. In fact, notions of a canal bypassing the Strait of Hormuz through the UAE date back nearly 2 decades. In September 2008, journalist David Robertson, writing for the Times of London, quoted an unnamed senior officer of the Dubai government who said that many studies had been conducted and presented on the subject of building a mega-canal, which would enable cargo vessels to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. While the unnamed official also confessed that so far none of the presented studies were, in his or her words, solid, Robertson reported that the project was expected, at the time, to cost a staggering $200 billion. Interestingly, he also reported a surprisingly specific piece of tangible information, which was that engineers were presenting plans for a canal that was precisely 112 miles, or 180 kilometers, in length. The same month that Roberts' article was published in the Times, an Emirati publication called Vajira in Focus provided further written analysis, claiming that the 180-kilometer route would begin in Dubai and end in Fujairah, on the UAE's eastern coast. A simple glance at a map reveals that this would be no small cut across the peninsula, but in fact, a deep artery running straight through the heart of the country. Not only that, but it would inevitably pass through the Hajar Mountains, a jagged range with an average elevation of 1,220 meters, formed out of brittle sheetrock that was once, millions of years ago, ocean floor. These varied, fractured and faulted layers of rock pose a unique geotechnical challenge, in addition to the sheer challenge of the inherent scale of the overall project. The fact that the UAE had apparently been looking into this monumental idea for almost 20 years came as a complete surprise to most people, even those who follow the news carefully. It's not just the sheer volume of news stories that gets in the way, it's also media bias. At Looking For, delving through the various reports and framings around the same topic is something we know all too well. And that's why we're proud to be partnering on today's video with Ground News. Ground News is a website and mobile app that compiles thousands of news articles every day and provides key, data-driven insights into the bigger picture those different sources are portraying from different angles. Not only can you see all the sources covering a story, but their factuality score shows how credible those sources are, while their bias distribution score reveals where on the political spectrum the story is getting more or less coverage. Even more striking, you can compare headlines side by side, revealing how the same story can be framed differently, depending on which source is reporting it. Take, for example, this story about the CFTC examining firms that placed oil trades shortly before the Iran war. Using Ground News' tools, you can see that the story was covered by 12 total sources with ranging reputations for factuality, and that none of those sources were independent. You can also see that the story received more coverage on the right than it did on the left. But perhaps more striking, Ground News reveals that in the headlines, several of the right-leaning sources use the word suspicious to describe the oil trades, and also mention a figure of $800 million, while other sources reporting the same story do not. This is just one example of how bias can, and often does, subtly shift the way a story is presented. This is the type of insight you won't get elsewhere. I personally use it and find it incredibly useful, and you will too if you're serious about seeing the full picture. Right now, you can subscribe to Ground News and get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan by scanning the QR code on screen or by using the unique link ground.news/looking-for. You'll find that link in the description. Thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video. And now, back to Dubai's plan to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. One question worth asking, both then and now, is why the UAE was so interested in such a prospect in the first place. The answer boils down to strategic insurance. The Strait of Hormuz is mostly located in Omani waters, but also passes through Iranian territory, the latter of whom has by far the largest naval capability. In 2008, there had been ongoing tensions between Iran and the US, centered around an incident that happened in the strait between Iranian Revolutionary Guard boats and US Navy ships.
Fortunately for everybody involved, they turned outbound before we got to the point where we needed to open fire.
Following this ultimately non-violent but quite threatening confrontation, Iran had threatened to impose controls on Gulf shipping. When Iran then conducted multiple missile tests around the same time, this exacerbated tensions between Iran and the West even further, and perhaps most significantly, drove the price of oil to $147 a barrel, adjusted for inflation, the highest it has ever been, even to this day. From the UAE's perspective, this all translated to vulnerability. As international tensions rose, the question became more and more appealing. What if the UAE could move oil, goods, and possibly even naval and commercial traffic from the Gulf to the open Indian Ocean without Iran's looming potential threat? But before debates over even the raw feasibility of the project could even begin, the 2008 financial crisis hit and took with it any notion of such an expensive and risky project. The UAE even had to abandon a comparatively meek canal project, the merely $11 billion Arabian Canal, in 2009 in the wake of the financial crisis. In short, this was a plan to carve a 75-kilometer waterway through the desert between Jebel Ali and a loop-around point around Dubai World Central. It wasn't mainly for ships, but instead for real estate. Compared to the Union Strait, it should have been relatively feasible, especially in the pre-2008 Dubai property boom. But following the crash, the original 2012 target completion date was deemed unattainable. And alongside the failed Arabian Canal, the dream of a 180-kilometer Emirati canal to bypass the Strait of Hormuz also began gathering dust on the shelves, and it continued to do so. Right up until a few months ago. The first sign that the idea might be resurfacing came, of all unexpected places, from the ex-account of a well-known American politician. Former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich posted on March 15, 2026, saying, quote, "Instead of fighting over a 21-mile wild bottleneck forever, we cut a new channel through friendly territory, a dozen thermonuclear weapons, and we've got a waterway wider than the Panama Canal, deeper than the Suez, and safe from Iranian attacks." In the post, Gingrich linked an article by commentator Jordan Schneider of China Talk, which turned out to be where Gingrich had derived the text of his post from. Schneider, seemingly satirically, framed the article as a public letter to US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, suggesting the United States spend $5 billion to, quote, "nuke a canal," and that such a solution would likely appeal to President Trump. Schneider even wrote at the bottom of the article, quote, "The views expressed above do not necessarily represent those of anyone with brain cells." Despite the disclaimer, however, Gingrich and others seemed genuinely intrigued by the idea. Then, roughly a month later, Znera Space unveiled their quite serious plan to do more or less exactly that, minus the nuclear detonations. The earliest post, at least that we can find today, was made on Znera's Instagram on April the 18th. It included a fairly extravagant aerial view mock-up and described the Union Strait as a speculative strategic study. This was soon followed by additional posts across various social media platforms. These additional posts included more mock-up images, including 2 potential paths along the peninsula which the canal could follow, and renderings which showed more clearly where Znera envisions the canal beginning on the coast of Dubai. These subsequent posts also saw the language change from merely speculative study to, quote, a strategic waterway for the future of the UAE. 4 days after the initial post, on April the 22nd, the proposal caught the attention of one of the leading global construction sector media companies, KHL Group. An article came out in the KHL published outlet Construction Briefing, outlining the proposal and sharing some of the mock-up images. At this point, the idea began to draw wider attention, and of course, some strong opinions, which we'll come to in a moment. But the first question anyone could be compelled to ask upon realizing that a major Emirati architecture firm appears to be dead serious about building it is, how? Amid the onslaught of continually updating headlines about conflict between American and Iranian ships in the Strait of Hormuz and the prospect of an impeding ceasefire agreement, this question is yet to be definitively answered, at least by anybody directly involved. That being said, the very nature of this proposal allows us to infer some likely facts about the Union Strait and what it would take to make it a reality. One thing we can be certain of is that, for the Union Strait to matter strategically, it would have to be built to handle oil tanker scale traffic at a level competitive with the Strait of Hormuz. A typical VLCC, which stands for Very Large Crude Carrier, is between 300 and 330 meters long and approximately 55 meters wide, requiring as much as 28 meters of water depth just to float comfortably. And of course, by sheer virtue of the peninsula's geography, we can know something of the length of the canal route from Dubai to Fujairah. The Defense Horizon Journal estimates that the shortest possible route from coast to coast through the Hajar Mountains would be at minimum 116 kilometers. To build such a canal through such difficult, mountainous desert terrain, 3 options stand out. First, Znera could opt to build a sea-level canal and employ massive excavation in the process. This would be the cleanest option for shipping once finished. However, the physical brutality of constructing it makes it border on impossibility unless an unusually low corridor is found through the Hajar Mountains. The second option would be to emulate Panama and build a lock canal. This would reduce a substantial amount of the excavation required, but it introduces new problems. The locks would have to be enormous to accommodate large tankers, and in addition to presenting the need for huge water management systems, a lock canal would also present the issue of bottlenecks and traffic jams, and potentially slower transit, which would diminish the canal's benefit as a Hormuz alternative. On top of that, a lock canal is more vulnerable to targeted attack, because if any of the lock complexes are damaged, the whole canal essentially shuts down. Still, there is a third, more futuristic option. Build a hybrid canal/tunnel. This, in theory, could avoid the worst excavation by adapting to the terrain. Dig a canal through sea level terrain, tunnel through the mountains, and use locks for any dramatic elevation changes. It would also theoretically offer increased protection, not only from attacks, but even from surveillance in the most vulnerable sectors. One could argue such a cutting-edge approach is also uniquely befitting of a firm like Znera Space, although to be clear, the firm has not publicly proposed a hybrid method of this type. However, the brutal reality is that ship tunnels at tanker scale are exceedingly difficult to build. Think of the size and required water depth of the typical VLCC we examined before. An effective tunnel would need huge width, huge height and air clearance, very deep water, ventilation, safe navigation margins, constant monitoring, collision protection, and numerous other logistical challenges. Plus, if something goes wrong, it is significantly harder to rectify when the problem is hidden beneath the surface of the Earth, for reasons that should be easy enough to imagine. And last but not least, the cost would be so high that it's difficult to estimate with much precision. Znera would essentially be combining the cost profiles of Suez-style excavation, Panama-style lock engineering, Alpine tunnel complexity, and all the untold security and environmental infrastructure surrounding it. It's safe to say such a project would easily rocket into the category of hundreds upon hundreds of billions of dollars. A tunneling approach of this kind is so challenging that it has arguably never even been properly achieved. For the best part of the past decade, Norway has been working toward building what they call the world's first full-scale ship tunnel to bypass the Stad Peninsula. But even with a proposed length of just 1.8 kilometers, the the project has continually stalled due to what Forbes magazine calls spiraling costs and competing priorities. So, how likely is this to actually happen? Well, one expert to offer his opinion on the matter is military and technology analyst Shariah Pasandida, who spoke with Arab News in March of 2026. Quote, "My comments are, of course, those of a military analyst, but there are also financial and economic factors to consider, including projected demand for oil and gas, and engineering and geological considerations. All things considered, a canal bypassing the Strait of Hormuz is not a practical solution." Pasandida's conclusion seems generally representative of the opinions of most. It is, indeed, a highly impractical idea. But then again, when have the most exciting or groundbreaking projects ever been entirely practical? The UAE has dazzled the world with futuristic megaprojects before. Perhaps, sooner or later, it will again.